McKay, talk about how this book came about. I mean, you had a pretty big scare a number of years ago that really led into this.
I did. About 6 years ago, I thought I had a running injury or a cycling injury. I had some pain in my left hip. I went to see a doctor who said I should see an orthopedist, who took an MRI, just a routine sort of medical procedure. And it turned out he called on a Friday afternoon and said, there's a suspicious mass in your abdomen and you need to call an oncologist right away. So I did that, and it turned out that I had a tumor in my abdomen about the size of a baseball. And my wife and I at the time had children who were a year and a half old and about 5. So of course we went into a full-blown panic about this. And about 4 weeks of real anxiety, making phone calls, Googling everything we could to figure out what this might be, I ended up on a surgeon's schedule in New York City. And right before I went in for surgery, I was in my scrubs, preparing myself for this big operation, and some medical researchers came up to me in the waiting room while I was in my scrubs getting ready for the operation, and they just started asking me, well, they asked if they could ask me some questions about something they were studying, and I said, well, that'd be fine. What could that be? And they said, well, we'd like to know about your chemical exposures over your lifetime. And I thought, what could that have to do with the tumor? I didn't really make the connection. And they said, well, they started asking about where I had worked, what kind of careers I'd had, where I had lived, and I sort of assumed in the first place that they'd be asking about whether I'd lived near an industrial site or near a hospital dump, hospital waste facility, something like that. That wasn't really what they were interested in. They were interested in the sort of everyday consumer chemicals that I might have come into contact with. This would include things like flame retardants or non-stick chemicals or stain-resistant chemicals, or the things that you find in paints or lacquer or building materials, lead, mercury, arsenic, all this kind of stuff. And the list of questions they asked was very long and really gave me quite a bit to think about. Now, don't forget, I'm within minutes of going in for surgery, so I was trying to keep my mind focused on kind of staying calm and not thinking too hard about that. Well, I had the operation, and I woke up, I think it was 4 hours later, and my wife and my surgeon were at the foot of my bed with big smiles on their faces, and I thought, well, something must have gone well. And it turned out that the tumor was benign after all. And I asked my surgeon, I said, how often does that happen, that a tumor like this is benign? He said, about 4 out of 100. So I drew the long straw on that one and felt extremely fortunate. But I was left with quite a few questions. I mean, if these people had been asking me these questions ahead of time, they must have suspected there was some kind of connection. And I, as a writer and a professor, I was left thinking there's got to be something to look into here. So I went back and spent about 3 years doing the research that I had never done before, looking into answers for some of these questions, and started to look into all of the chemicals that are in the various consumer products that we use. Now, I'm sure this won't strike people as unfamiliar, but it's worth thinking about how this all came to be. Now, it turns out that the chemicals that we have become very used to using, the products we've come to be comfortable using, have only really existed for about 60 or 70 years. Most of the huge burst in consumer production has happened since World War II, at least the stuff that is made with mostly petrochemicals, synthetic chemicals. And therefore, we spent 60 or 70 years becoming very used to using lots of products, the origin of which we're not entirely familiar with. And that leads us to come to a point in history where we use things where we don't really know what went into them, and we also haven't had enough time really to chart the medical repercussions of using these things. So not only are we just now beginning to wake up to the fact that we've been marinating in this stuff for a long time, but science is finally starting to catch up with this and produce enough research to say things like, if you use flame retardant chemicals in your mattresses, in your computers, in your children's pajamas, all kinds of things, it shouldn't surprise you that these chemicals, as they disintegrate and degrade, end up in the atmosphere, end up in the air and the water, and they end up in your bodies, and we can actually test for that. So this book is broken into about 5 chapters. The first chapter talks a little bit about my own story and where I was led with all of these questions. The next chapter, I go to the state of Maine, and in the state of Maine, they've done one of a number of very impressive, what they call body burden studies, where they take samples of people's blood, hair, and urine, and they can put them in a laboratory and tell the people who participate in the study what kinds of chemicals are in their body. Now, we don't yet have the science to say that just because we could find flame retardants in your body, therefore you're absolutely going to develop breast cancer. They can't do that yet. What they can do is say, we can find these chemicals in your body, and in a laboratory we can find out that these chemicals produce cancer in lab animals. Now the science, if in many places like in Europe, that's all you need. If you have it in people's bodies and in a laboratory and turns out they cause health problems, they ban them. They regulate them very heavily. In the United States, that's not the case. So in Maine, the question was, how did all these people get these chemicals in their bodies, and what did that lead to? In Maine, enough people got concerned about the number. I mean, there were dozens of chemicals showing up in people's bodies. And as you know, Maine is not New York City. Maine is a very rural place. Maine is a very poor place. There's not a lot of industry up there. So these people that we're talking about were everyday citizens. They were not industrial plant workers. You know, they were not making petrochemicals. These are just, in fact, one of them was the head of the Maine Organic Farmers Association. One was a young woman who grew up in Aroostook County, which is the farthest northern county in Maine, up near the Canadian border. I mean, pristine wilderness up there. These people all had flame retardants and stain resistors and, you know, phthalates and bisphenol A, lead, you know, you name it, they was in their bodies. So the question was, how does that happen? And what we've discovered, of course, is that these chemicals, when we use so many of them, they don't stay put. They break down and they start circulating. They circulate, as I mentioned before, in the air, in the water. Scientists can find these chemicals, have found these chemicals on the top of Aconcagua, which is the highest mountain in South America. They found these chemicals in the bodies of Inuit people in the Arctic. They found these chemicals in the bodies of beluga whales in the St. Lawrence water up in Canada. These are extremely remote places, and yet these chemicals are migrating around the globe. So what we've discovered now is that we use so many of these products, so many of these chemicals, that these chemicals are now starting to show up in our bodies wherever we are under whatever circumstances. So that's one chapter, going to Maine, talking about these body burden studies.